Good evening, everyone. My name is DeAndrea, and I'm so excited to be here speaking with you today about local versus global solutions to the climate crisis, specifically about research that I conducted to develop a metric that quantitatively analyzes how well countries are doing with implementing United Nations climate policy. Last year, I attended a service trip to the Dominican Republic centered around sustainable agriculture, and there was one moment on this trip that really stuck out to me. So we were at a local environmental college in the Dominican Republic, and our group leader was explaining to us the service projects that we were going to be completing that day. And he's giving us some instructions, and he mentions that we're going to be doing agroforestry. And now when I hear this, my face lights up. I am so excited, and I'm looking around, I'm trying to find someone who's sharing in this excitement, and not to my surprise, I'm not finding anybody. But the reason for me that when I heard agroforestry, I got so excited was because just a month prior, I'd used it as a plan at one of my Model UN conferences. And Model UN for me was my introduction to the world of international relations, inspiring my goals for my future career and studies in college. And so the opportunity that just by chance, I was able to take a hypothetical solution that I'd created for a simulation of a United Nations committee and then actually play an active role in seeing that tangible change through the plan I'd created was really incredible for me. The other takeaway that I had from this experience was that when I was originally thinking about agroforestry, it was from a policy standpoint. I was thinking about how can the UN implement this as a solution to the climate crisis. But when it came time to actually make that change, actually see the implementation of agroforestry through, it was at the local level, not at the policy level. And that tension, that relationship between local and global climate policy is what I want to speak about today. For my senior capstone research project, I wanted to answer the question, how effective is United Nations climate policy? And the way I did this was developing a metric that I call the United Nations Climate Implementation Index. And as I stated before, this measures how well countries are doing with implementing UN climate policy. I then used the score of countries on my metric to compare to their broader environmental performance to see, is the UN implementation actually resulting in environmental change? Is this policy actually effective? So, before I get into my results, I want to break down the methodology behind this metric and what actually goes into it. So there are a ton of different components inside the UN that create climate policy, different committees, organs, bodies, conventions, laws. So I had to narrow it down really specifically to make a statistically accurate measurement to numerically measure these implementation rates. And I narrowed it down to 3 key sectors. The first, treaty signatures. How many climate-related treaties did a country sign on to that the UN produces? The next involves the Paris Agreement, arguably the most important piece of climate legislature produced to date. And this took their nationally determined contribution, or NDC, which is the percent reduction that that country promised to reduce their carbon emissions by 2030. So what percentage that country is saying they can cut down their carbon emissions, that's the value that went into that sector. And the third section is the climate-related Sustainable Development Goals. If you don't know what the UN Sustainable Development Goals are, basically these are 17 objectives that the UN has to create a more sustainable future by 2030. And each of these 17 goals has different quantitative sub-targets that are outlined to rank the countries on how well they're actually meeting these goals. So, for example, Goal 13 is climate action. And under that, there are quantitative sub-targets like carbon emissions coming from imports and carbon emissions coming from exports. So those rankings of how well the countries are doing with those quantitative sub-targets that are climate-related are what went into my final metric. And now you may have heard me mention during the Sustainable Development Goals section and the treaty section that I only included things that were climate-related. And when developing a metric, it was really important for me that I created an operational definition to explain what does climate-related mean in my metric. How am I going to determine which of these policies is actually climate-related? And to do so, I drew on the research of Johan Rockström, who created the Planetary Boundaries Framework. And what this is, it's a widely recognized concept in the scientific community, stating the 9 processes that humans have control over to keep the Earth's environment stable and to cause environmental change to actually prevent ecosystems from tipping over into instability. So every climate policy that went into my metric had to directly tie to one of these 9 boundaries in order to be included. And so now that I've explained the methodology, this is what the final equation looked like. It's a mathematical model that takes into account all 3 sectors, and the really important thing to note here is that this is a comparative value. So you'll see in my results that some countries, one South Africa in particular, had a negative value on my metric. This doesn't mean that they had negative climate implementation rates. It means that compared to what other countries were doing, they were below average. So that's where that negative value is coming from. My metric is comparing, not necessarily giving a % score out of 100 or something like that. So now let's get into what I actually found using this metric. I tested different countries on my metric and then compared them to their Environmental Performance Index score, or EPI. The EPI, for those of you who don't know, measures general environmental performance outside of a policy context. So these are things like carbon emissions coming from that country, the levels of pollution, the water quality, all these different factors that contribute to general environmental health. So I took the 180 countries that the EPI ranks, and I split it into 4 quarters, randomly selected 2 countries from each of those 4 quarters, and those are the test countries that you see on the screen right now. So Germany and Costa Rica, those are the 2 countries who had the highest from that high quarter of the EPI rankings. Cabo Verde and China were the 2 countries selected from that lowest quarter of EPI rankings. Now I'll just break down this data table just to make it a little bit more digestible. I'll go through Germany here. So first, in this first column, you have they were rated 3rd out of 180 countries on the EPI, that general environmental performance scaled. Then in the second column, you have their score on my metric, which was an 87. And you can see that's higher than every other country on this list except for China. And then in the third column is a comparative ranking of these 8 countries to show what order they were in for the values that they scored on my metric. And then as a reference point, I've also included their GDP ranking out of all of the countries. So what do we see in these results? Among the countries, many of them actually do have the implementation rates correlating with the EPI scores. So you can see for Germany, Costa Rica, Singapore, and Israel, the EPI says that those should be in that order for how well they're doing environmentally. My metric has them in the order of 2, 3, 4, and 5 in the comparative ranking. They're in the correct order. Their implementation rates are producing similar general environmental standing rankings. But the really important discrepancy to take away from this data table is the case of China, who was ranked 156 out of 180 countries on the EPI for their environmental performance. Yet, they were number 1 on my metric. Ahead of Germany, ahead of Costa Rica, they had the highest implementation rate. But that implementation rate didn't actually manifest in them getting a high environmental standing. So to see if this was just the case for China, or if this was a broader problem with UN climate policy, I took the 3 countries with the highest amounts of carbon emissions. In order, China, the United States of America, and India. We already went through China. We saw the discrepancy there. The United States actually does line up between the 2 scores from the EPI and from my implementation index. You can see that the United States' EPI puts it above Costa Rica, and its implementation score also puts it above Costa Rica, and those 2 values are below Germany's. So those are staying the same in the rankings. But when you get to India, you see another massive discrepancy. India was ranked 176 out of 180 total countries on the EPI for their general environmental performance. The bottom 5 worst environmentally standing countries. Yet, on my metric, they scored a 62, placing them only 1 point below the United States and above almost every single country that I tested for their UN implementation. So what does this mean? Quite frankly, it means the policy isn't working. The implementation rates are not resulting in actual environmental change, and especially in these large GDP nations like India, China, United States, Germany, all of these countries that have super high GDP values. They are able to use their resources to sign on to this climate policy without actually yielding any genuine environmental change. And if it's not working in countries like China and India, who alone account for over 40% of global carbon emissions, it's not working anywhere. So, the UN climate policy isn't working. Where does that leave us? It may leave us feeling disheartened because the policy framework that's supposed to be creating genuine change isn't. But really, it should leave us feeling inspired, because that means that the change isn't in the hands of the policymakers, it's in ours. And so I want to share some examples of some local climate solutions that have had huge real-world impact. A few summers ago, I visited Freiburg, Germany on a sustainability-focused trip, where we visited the Vauban district. And in this district, there was a community who came together to construct their homes in a sustainable manner. As you can see in the image, all of the housing is put together. There's no gaps in between the individual housing. And this was done so that this whole community could work together to minimize the disturbance they had on the natural ecosystem and create a more environmentally sustainable manner of constructing their homes. Similarly, in the Black Forest in Switzerland, there was an energy group who used wood chips as a form of renewable energy. So by combusting the wood chips, they were able to generate power and then distribute that power, and it ended up being so large scale that it could actually have enough energy to power the entire surrounding community just from these wood chips, a massive decrease in reliance on carbon emissions in this area. But these changes aren't just abroad. They aren't just in Germany and Switzerland. They might be in your own backyard. And this was the case for me when I heard about Sadler's Woods Conservation Association. This is an environmental conservation group who was actually based only 1 or 2 miles away from my house, and I had no idea that it existed until I started working with them this fall. Through this experience, I've been able to get involved with initiatives like bringing the American chestnut back from its functional extinction, or, as depicted above, cultivating a native meadow, which essentially promotes the growth of native plants inside forests to promote native biodiversity and subsequently increase climate resilience. So those were just a few examples of local solutions that can have real impact. And I know it may be cliche to say that one person can make a difference, but we've seen the numbers. The big scale change isn't making the difference, so it has to come from that local community, small scale efforts. And now, I'm not going to say that the individual change that you make is going to solve the climate crisis, because that would be infeasible, but you can be one part of the puzzle, one piece of a larger movement that's working in the right direction to create a more sustainable future. I introduced this talk with the title Local Solutions, Global Standards, and I explain these as two mutually exclusive concepts. But it doesn't have to be that way. Local solutions, if every individual does their part, if as a collective, everyone decides to promote small-scale initiatives, can become the new global standard. A global standard that is far more powerful than what any climate legislation could create. And now the change, as shown in my metric, isn't coming from large-scale UN climate policy. The change is coming from that small community in Freiburg, Germany, who decided to turn the construction of their homes into a sustainability effort. The change is coming from the person in rural Switzerland who decided to create an energy center that decreases a whole community's reliance on fossil fuels. And the change is all of you. Thank you so much for your time. I sincerely hope that this inspired you to get out and do your part, because we really are all working for something larger than ourselves. Thank you.